Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 27th of May. So I'm hopeful by this point that you've had an opportunity to read or at least begin reading Frankenstein, though we are going to be spending a couple of classes talking about Frankenstein. You'll remember that last class I had begun by talking about an academic essay entitled The Cult of True Womanhood to lay a foundation of what might have happened historically in the 1800s for female. And I wanted to continue that conversation. You can see in the notes below that I've got several links for you to look at. The first is a booklet that actually I have hanging in my office that I was able to find in an antique store. And it was a booklet that was distributed through doctors to their young female patients. This is a picture from a 1906 medical pamphlet arguing that college is bad for girls. And you can see the booklet, or at least the photo of the booklet that I took, in order to be able to give you a sense of some of the concerns at the time period. And they included the evils of dormitory life, midnight hours of who knows what, flirting and speaking to male students without proper introduction and chaperone, reading improper novels, magazines, and other suggestive literature, and forming unladylike habits that could harm the health and morals of a delicate girl, such as smoking and card playing. So in addition to that, I've got a link to the idea of Smithsonian Magazine talking a bit about female response to Darwin's Origin of Species. And if you know anything at all about Darwin, then you know about his theory of evolution. And what perhaps is not as well known is that his theory of evolution argued that males were evolutionary, and from an evolutionary perspective, superior to females because females were inferior because of their tasks associated with reproduction. And again, you can see this particular article by clicking on the link to the Smithsonian Magazine. And it talks a little bit about how, from a scientific perspective, it was thought at the time that there was evidence to prove female inferiority. And how a preacher with no scientific training ended up writing perhaps the first feminist critique of the origin of species. I continue on by directing you to a third link that you might be interested in reading. And you don't have to read them carefully. You can certainly skim them. I think you're already getting a sense of what life was like in the 1800s for female. A teacher's contract from 1923, and there is some debate as to whether or not this is a truly authentic teacher's contract. But regardless, this 1923 teacher's contract gives you an idea, certainly, of the tone of the times, even if it isn't completely authentic. And the rules that a good teacher would need to follow, including but not limited to staying out of ice cream parlors. Again, I encourage you to look at the link so that you can see the list of rules. And the Good Wives Guide from the 1950s, which also has been under dispute as to whether or not this is authentic. But again, it gives you a sense as to what the expectations for female might have been like during the time period of the 1950s, which really was not that long ago. School teachers in 1923 were banned from wearing bright colors, makeup, dyed hair, and needed to wear at least 2 petticoats. And whether or not this is completely authentic, I think you get the sense of how important it was for female to maintain those elements that we had talked about last class of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And of course, while the 1950s, which was a more progressive time, the assumption was still in the 1950s that female would ultimately be domestic and pious and pure and submissive. And I have yet one more article for you to look at. And this is 5 things that women couldn't do in the 1960s, which might surprise you. Again, we're getting perhaps closer to contemporary times. I can tell you that I was born in 1967. So, yes, you can do the math. The answer is 57. It'll be 58 this summer. But the 1960s were really the beginning of the pushback for getting female autonomy. And it surprises many contemporary readers how little autonomy female had even in the 1960s, which is known for being a very progressive time. But some of the things that women weren't able to do was to, for instance, maintain credit in their own name, which is hugely important, being able to have economic power. One of the things that is not discussed in The Story of an Hour, which was the short story that I had us review last class, is whether or not Louise Mallard has children. And the assumption is that she doesn't because no children are mentioned. And if that is indeed the case, then Brentley Mallard's death would ultimately result in her having a certain amount of economic power if we assume that Brentley Mallard had an estate. And it would seem, at least from the little bit of information that we get, that they're at least comfortable. And that would perhaps explain why there was a lower rate of remarriage in the 1800s for widowed female than there was for widowed male, because if widowed female was able to achieve some level of economic independence, then why would she want to put that in jeopardy through another marriage? And one of the things that I think is central in keeping in mind as we're reading these texts is that none of these texts reflect a 2025 reality, but all of these texts influenced a 2025 reality. Now, the last link I have for you, and again, you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time with this link or even watch it. It happens to be a video, and it is by a media studies scholar. Her name is Jean Kilbourne. You might have heard of her. She's done several documentaries under the title of Killing Us Softly, where she started in the 1970s looking at magazine advertisements to see how women were portrayed. Sound familiar? After all, this is how the Culture True Womanhood went about trying to get a sense of female. And Jean Kilbourne would basically update her documentary about once a decade. So she did this in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s. And as much as things change, they remain the same. And she gave a talk in 2019 talking a little bit about the progress of her scholarship over the decades and the state of femalehood at that particular time. So it is 2 hours long. It was done by the Media Education Foundation. And again, you're not required to watch it, but I encourage you to watch it because I think it's very enlightening in terms of understanding the role of female. And understanding that role of female perhaps helps us understand the ending of Joy That Kills in The Story of an Hour, as many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses that it wasn't necessarily an ending that you had hoped for, but it was an ending that you could understand based on the limitations of female autonomy during the time period. And I've always argued that literature, in part, tries to bring about social and political change. So we're not supposed to embrace the ending and think of it as a positive. We're supposed to wonder how it is that society can change so that there won't be a Mrs. Mallard in real life who ultimately loses all autonomy through marriage. And that said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the upcoming paper, and we're not going to be doing our paper until about midway through the semester, but I understand how incredibly condensed the summer session is, and you might want to at least get a sense as to how you could proceed with a paper. So if you were to look at the general section in our Moodle site above, you'll see the syllabus and other documents folder. And in the syllabus and other documents folder, I have included our paper topics, which we are going to revisit as the semester begins. But basically, I wanted you to be able to get a sense to begin contemplating what you could write a paper about. And both of these papers, one is due about midway through the semester and one is due towards the ending of the semester, are going to be critical papers. In other words, you shouldn't be consulting outside sources. It should be based on your own interpretations, based on what we've talked about in class, and just your own understanding of the text. Length would be approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately means approximately. That it should be as long as it needs to be to support your position or your thesis. Something that we will talk a little bit more about and as the semester progresses on how to write a paper. And what I've done is I've listed a topic for you to choose to write about. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but you can see that it's a very open-ended topic that gives you lots of possibilities. Or you can also write on your own topic, but if you choose to write on your own topic, you should discuss that topic with me, and you need to get that topic approved prior to actually constructing a paper on that topic. And you would be quoting from the text as part of your evidence and using the MLA, and I hope this sounds familiar, Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation when quoting. Basically, after a quote, we use a parentheses, and within that parentheses, we give some information to the reader about how to authenticate that quote by finding where it appears. And the syllabus, as we had talked about recently, talks about paper formatting specifications, that paper should be typed in double space and 1-inch margins. But again, we will be revisiting all of this. So paper number 1 would be addressing one of the earlier readings in the semester, which we started with The Story of an Hour. The Cult of True Womanhood isn't a piece of literature, so you really wouldn't be writing a paper about that. But you could reference it, perhaps, in your paper about The Story of an Hour. And The Story of an Hour, as you know, is a short story. So that's a very different kind of animal than talking about a novel. Our next piece is Frankenstein, and that's a novel. And the novel that follows is Persuasion. And that would get us about midway through the semester. Paper number 2, you have the same topic with the same guidelines, but it would address one of the later readings in the semester, which would probably be either Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. And we are also doing Dickinson's poetry, even though I don't have it necessarily listed. So that is another possibility. But of course, talking about a poem is a very different sort of thing than talking about a short story or talking about a novel. So the topic is a quotation that I have selected from the essay that we discussed, The Cult of True Womanhood. Examine how the following quote, girls could be ruined by a book which attacked or seemed to attack woman's accepted place in society. In Barbara Welter's The Cult of True Womanhood applies to the text or texts you have selected for your paper. But regardless of your topic, you need to provide textual evidence and details to support your arguments, which is basically using quotation from the text. And at the bottom of this, I've got a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or when you're reading somebody else's writing. Is, quote, have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, unquote. And you can see that in the parentheses following that, I've got the author's last name from the origins of that quote, Biddle, and the page number where that quote appears, 9, and then close quotes, and then I end my punctuation. And again, we'll talk about MLA conventions a little bit more in depth as we get a bit closer. And I understand this is a tall order, writing something that's clear, concise, believable, or graceful. I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. I think that's quite true. But I thought I would at least give you the topic now so that you can begin contemplating possibilities. Perhaps you already feel inspired by the story of an hour, so that that's what you want to devote your paper to. Perhaps as you are in the midst of Frankenstein, that's what's going to inspire you. Or Persuasion, which comes after Frankenstein. Now, in terms of Frankenstein, I had discussed that it would be ideal if when we get to a text, you would have read it in its entirety, so that as we are discussing it, you are at home reading the next text. So what would be ideal is that you finished reading the novel Frankenstein and you are reading the novel Persuasion at this point. And you can see in the notes below that I have included web links for these things. So if it turns out that you don't have the text for either Frankenstein or Persuasion, I've at least offered some free links that you could read the text from online, though I always prefer paper because I think it's easier to annotate that way. And for those of you who have not necessarily gotten to that place, worry not. We do the best we can with the time that we've got. So what I wanted to do was just to introduce Frankenstein today, and then we could talk about it much more in depth next class. And Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a noted feminist. And I can't help but think of my own experiences with Frankenstein. I would have been in about maybe the third grade or so, and we were supposed to have this kind of white elephant Christmas exchange, and we were very clearly told that girls should buy girl toys and boys should buy boy toys. And I, being at that young age interested in horror and gothic, had gotten a puzzle of Frankenstein, or at least the version that we think of for Frankenstein in the media. And I remember how upset the teacher was when the gift was unwrapped by a girl, someone else in the class, and the teacher said, "This is a boy's gift." And I'm pretty sure that the teacher had no idea that Frankenstein was written by a female and does talk about feminist issues. I didn't know that at that time either. I just knew how iconic Frankenstein was because of Hollywood. And the Hollywood version of Frankenstein is very different than what Mary Shelley wrote. And Mary Shelley was just a teenager when she wrote this. She was 19 years old. So, really, what she was able to do was phenomenal. And she and her partner, Percy Shelley, a name that you might be familiar with because he's one of the great romantic poets, he reviewed her work and edited it and made suggestions. And because of that, there was some controversy afterwards as to whether or not she could be viewed as the true author of the work if Percy Shelley had given her suggestions. And I'm pretty sure that if the situation had been reversed and if she had given suggestions to Percy, I don't think there would have been any question about authorship. But nevertheless, the way the story came about is that she and Percy and some friends were on holiday and they were experiencing some inclement weather. So, because they had to stay indoors, they challenged each other to a ghost story writing competition. And that evening, Mary Shelley had a nightmare about the famous creation scene where Frankenstein is created, and that's what's motivated her to write the text. And then when Percy Shelley reviewed it, he suggested that she expand and develop her text. And there are long passages in the text that discuss the natural environment that might not necessarily seem to be essential to the forwarding of the plot, but this was very common during the time period, the Romantic movement, to talk about nature and the natural world and celebrate its sublime beauty. And even though Mary Shelley has written a very male-centric text, you'll see that female characters are few and far between, and most of them fit into that stereotype that we were talking about in the Cult of True Womanhood. nature itself could be seen as a feminine force. And if so, then perhaps nature is the central character of the text, and nature provides respite and relief and rejuvenation. And we will see this as the characters completely isolate themselves and in pursuit of scientific knowledge and the negative consequences of not only isolating oneself from nature and the natural world, but removing oneself from feminine influence. But again, most people don't necessarily know Frankenstein from the text that Mary Shelley wrote. Most people know Frankenstein from the 1930s film that was done and by James Whale. And I thought it would be interesting to begin by having you view that particular film. And what I suspect is that most of you, while you know of the film, you probably have not seen the film. It's a film that I also assign in my Gothic literature class because it is an incredibly important text in terms of the Gothic tradition. And what you will see in this film is a very different story from what Mary Shelley wrote. So when you do watch this film, don't expect that you're going to get a plot summary at all. And thinking about some of the changes that are made to this film is something that we'll talk about in our next class. The link that I was able to find for you is on archive.org, though you might have your own streaming services where you can see. And I do want you to pay particular attention to the opening credits because I think they also set the scene for how female would be viewed in the time period of the early 1900s. The film is an hour and 10 minutes long. So and the story will straddle lots of genres: gothic, science fiction, and also feminist texts, which we will talk about last class as well. Um, but I hope you enjoy the film. And again, don't think of it as a plot summary, think of it as a very different text. This also gives you a little bit of time to catch up with reading Frankenstein if you haven't already finished the novel. And then next class we can talk about it more in depth. So what's left is our attendance question. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. So I've responded to all of your responses for your introductions and also for the Joy That Kills question about the story of an hour. So this attendance question is going to be due on Thursday, the 29th. But of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And it will be directed to that 1931 film version of Frankenstein that you're going to be seeing. Did you like or dislike the film and why? So note that there are no right or wrong answers here, deliberately so. What I'm more interested in is your reasoning. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I'm very curious to see what you think of the very iconic 1931 version of Frankenstein. Take care. Bye bye.